Director Buschatzke, please, sir. And after we finish with Director Buschatzke, we'll have time for some questions and answers, and we hope that you'll have a supply of those ready for both him and other members of these panels. I did neglect to introduce Guillermo Espiga, who's here with Mr. Riva, and we are grateful that he would be here and come in from Boston as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Representative Bowers, for moderating the panel, and thank you to Representative Nutt for the invitation for the department to come and speak at this conference. One of the good things about going last is that you can comment on comments made already. One of the bad things is maybe half the stuff you were going to talk about has already been talked about, but hopefully we can speed this up a little bit because I know we're behind schedule. But just to put in context what we're talking about here for the future of the state of Arizona, today we're using about 7 million acre-feet of water. That's actually 100,000 acre-feet less water than we used about 60 years ago, despite the 6-fold increase in population and the 18-fold increase in economic activity. But we have challenges moving forward. Coming out of something called the Water Resources Development Commission, something the legislature had DWR put together based on 2010 legislation, the department looked forward 100 years and determined that a potential supply and demand imbalance of 3.2 million acre-feet of water could hit the state of Arizona. The demand in that Water Resource Development Commission process was very aggressive, showing very large growth, something that I think many of us hope actually occurs, large population and economic growth throughout the state of Arizona. So we do have some supplies in hand to close that gap. We have potential increased use of reclaimed water, treated effluent, but desal will be part of that equation as well moving forward. I'm going to focus most of my presentation on the activities that the state of Arizona has been involved in desalination over the last several years, but I did want to address a couple of things. First, Clive talked about the paradigm in Israel in terms of the top-down situation there with the federal government and how they control and move forward these water projects in Israel. And I had the pleasure of going to Israel in October of 2015 with Governor Ducey and talked to a couple of deputy ministers in those ministries that Clive talked about, and they kind of looked at me and said, "Tom, it's simple. Just go back and do this in Arizona." And I said to them, I probably don't have the authority to do that. I might need some muscle to help me get that done in the state of Arizona. But in that regard, one of our big challenges, and Clive mentioned it, is we have a lot of groups who are involved with water, different water right holders, different water users, different organizations, and they all have a role in water management in the state of Arizona. And in that regard, I'll add to something Chuck talked about in relation to CAWCD's Section 5 contract with the Secretary of the Interior to move water off the river. That contract is a key part of what they are able to do, a very important contract. There are other water users in Arizona that have Section 5 contracts, but in all cases, all Section 5 contracts of that nature are subject to a 1944 contract between the state of Arizona and the Secretary of the Interior. So I just bring that up to show the complicated nature of how all these little pieces fit together and how we have to collaboratively work on these water issues within our state. I also wanted to mention, and Chuck mentioned about the costs of the desal. Chuck and I were kibitzing and doing a calculation of the El Paso plant costs and came up with about $1,000 per acre foot. To put that in perspective, the average price for residential use in the Phoenix metropolitan area is somewhere around $500 or $600. The median price, however, for a median user is closer to that $1,100 to even $1,500 per acre foot, depending on how much water you use in the summer versus winter, because there are differential rate structures. So that brackish groundwater desal price is competitive with the price of potable water that really we're starting to see, at least in the Phoenix metropolitan area. So how do I get to my presentation here? That's Chuck's. end slide. Here. Which one is yours? I think I can't read that.
Desalination, FCX.
It might be, try this one. This one?
Poseidon.
Oh, that's Poseidon. Where's DWR? No. No, that's not it. Maybe that one. There we go.
Good to go.
Okay. So in 2012, the Bureau of Reclamation did a Colorado River Basin supply and demand study with the 7 basin states. 15 options related to ocean or brackish groundwater desalination were identified in that study. Many of the water users in the state of Arizona were participants in that study led by the Department of Water Resources at that time. Obviously, that identified the potential for ocean desalination, desalination of agricultural drain water, and desalination of brackish water. And there was potential value to the Colorado River system from those options. I won't get into this slide too much. And that really led to the 7 basin states. Chuck mentioned who they were in his presentation, but the basin states put together an augmentation work group. There was a chair from the upper basin, and there was a chair from the lower basin. The chair from the lower basin was me, as then the assistant director of DWR, and now as the director of DWR. We leveraged some existing studies that had already been done. You can see that in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, a study done by CAWCD, Southern Nevada Water Authority, and MET, looking at potential sources. And you can see there Pacific Ocean desal, Gulf of California desalination, Yuma area brackish groundwater, and Coachella Valley drain water, and Imperial Valley drain water. So just trying to get an overview of what might be out there that the basin states collectively could look at for desalination options. Chuck mentioned, I think, the Yuma desalting plant. It's kind of a white elephant at this point. The technology is outdated. I think the number to get it up to running at about 1/3 of capacity at somewhat of a safe environment, we've heard from the Bureau of Reclamation, is $25 million. That's quite a bit of money, and of course we want them to pay it so they fulfill their obligation that Chuck talked about in terms of augmenting the supply of the river. But we haven't been able to close that loop with them. There was a pilot project that was funded by, again, those 3 water agencies, CAWCD, MET, and SNWA, to test running that at 1/3 plant capacity, and that was actually a successful test. So there's a big mound of brackish groundwater in the Yuma area. Estimates from a Black and Veatch study, again, Black and Veatch working with CAWCD, identified 50,000 acre-feet of water per year could come out of that mound of saline water in the Yuma area. And in 2017, CH2M updated the cost and came up with this number of about $550 per acre foot. So again, we've talked about this before, but in Arizona's Next Century, a Strategic Vision for Water Supply Sustainability 2014 report done by the Department of Water Resources, we recognize the need to augment our water supplies to meet that supply and demand deficit that I talked about earlier, and that desalination was one of the options to make that happen. So again, the strategic vision talks about potentially partnering with California, since they do have an ocean, in terms of desalinating their ocean water. There are ways then you could exchange that water for their Colorado River water, potentially get it to different places in Arizona through that mechanism. Also identifying options with Mexico. Chuck mentioned Minute 323, which was just signed this last fall in September. but there was a prior pilot minute 319 signed in 2012 that also talked about desalination options between the United States and Mexico. Thus, we carried forward that idea into the 2014 DWR report. The Governor's Water Augmentation Council Desalination Committee. So in October of 2015, Governor Ducey announced his water initiative, and he created two pathways forward in that initiative, a planning area process, which we won't get into today, but also the Water Augmentation Council that was charged with looking at ways to augment our water supplies, including through additional water conservation methods, reclaimed reuse, things like that. We did create a desalination committee on August 5th, 2016. And again, their charge was to explore opportunities for in-state desalination with a focus on brackish groundwater and effluent supplies. And their goal, again, is to identify potentially a project to actually move forward with. One of the other Augmentation Council committees that's really important is there's a funding committee. We know this will cost a lot of money, any augmentation idea. And Sandy Favorites is actually the chair of that funding committee, a big challenge. So we have various committees moving forward through the Water Augmentation Council process. The Desalination Committee did make a recommendation to the full council and was to continue to evaluate areas for feasibility of a desal project and then collaborate with local and regional stakeholders within the identified project area, and of course to discuss funding opportunities with that finance committee to try to find a real path forward and do a pilot, at least a pilot project. On one of Chuck's slides, this map was up on his slide, but it shows the areas of the state where we do have substantial pockets of brackish groundwater. Again, up in northeast Arizona, a little bit in northwest, central Arizona, the Phoenix area going south down into Pinal County, and then all the way along the Gila River into Yuma. Some also on the west part of Arizona, and then down in southeast Arizona. So these are all areas that the council committee looked at. And I also want to point out that the original version of this map was done in 1973 by a DWR employee. So this has been around a long time. And so maybe it's about time we started getting more serious about making some of this happen. So again, I think Chuck might have mentioned this, but there was a list created by Montgomery and Associates for CAWCD. That report was used by the committee to help narrow down their selections. There's a big matrix of different parameters that were looked at by the committee to kind of test which would be the best areas. And right now they're focusing on 3 areas. Again, the Yuma area, brackish groundwater mound, West Salt River Valley, west of Phoenix, and again, Winslow Loop, that big, huge area in northeastern Arizona that includes the Indian reservations. Moving forward quickly then to minute 323. It did, as I said, extend provisions of the prior minute 319, and extends those provisions through 2026. It does also include drought mechanisms in the minute in parallel and parity to what we have to do here in the United States in Arizona. And if we get the additional lower basin drought contingency plan, which is another tool to help protect Lake Mead in place, then that similar requirements for Mexico and flexibilities for Mexico would kick in. We did execute that in September 2017. Again, that actual minute was an agreement between the United States government and the Mexican government, but documents and agreements to make this minute work were necessarily signed by the state of Arizona, and in part by CAWCD, was helping to fund some conservation projects in Mexico to end up with some of that water, as Chuck talked about earlier. So the minute did require the creation of a binational desalination work group. It's Article 9B of the minute outlines that creation of that group. It also specifically identifies the potential look at a desal plant in the Sea of Cortez. The DWR director volunteered to be the U.S. co-chair of that work group. There's also a co-chair from Mexico. So we're moving forward with that process. And again, it's to look at Sea of Cortez. We're supposed to put a scope of work for further study by March 26th of 2018. Some of the scope of work will include proposed tasks, a study schedule, the estimated study budget, and then the U.S. and Mexico roles. And there are different ways we need to explore to get that desal water back up into the United States, potentially direct delivery by pipeline across the Arizona border, but again, through exchange potentially for some of Mexico's Colorado River water. And I do want to reiterate the point that Chuck made about this process. So the Department of Water Resources, CAWCD, Freeport, and Salt River Project agreed to fund a consultant, Black & Veatch. Again, Black & Veatch has done a lot of work over the years for CAWCD and others and has a lot of expertise. But we agreed to fund them to help facilitate the creation of this scope of work. Again, really important that we move this forward in a very timely manner. And again, by having several entities within the state who have interest and who have money to put into this process, helping to make sure that Arizona has a large piece of that pie, because there are others who are interested in the lower basin, for example, to get a piece of that Mexican desalination pie that's potentially out there. So I wanted to end with just a few observations. I've jotted down a couple here today and came in with some, but desalination is definitely in Arizona's future. I will say, though, that there are communities that are concerned about the local area impacts for treating and transporting away from their area brackish groundwater desalination. We heard those concerns in the Desal Committee of the Water Augmentation Council, concerns from the Yuma area. Desalination is not a panacea that at this time is going to address all of Arizona's water management challenges. These things take a long time to put into place, 15, 20 years or more. We need to continue to look forward and work on our water management policies, our water laws, to make sure that, as we always have in Arizona, that we're going to address those issues in a timely manner. So again, desal's out in our future. We got things we got to work on while we're also working on desal. So again, we must continue to build on the successful water management ethic that Arizona is known for. And I just wanted to make one last comment, because I think it was Scott that brought up the issue of the deep well brine injection. And in Arizona, all aquifers, all underground water, all aquifers are considered by law to be drinking water quality aquifers. So at this point in time, you could not put that brine from a brackish groundwater desal plant into an aquifer. That is an issue that we are going to have to wrestle with, and I think you all in this body and your friends across the mall there in the Senate are going to have to also wrestle with that issue. One of many issues we're going to have to collectively wrestle with as we move forward to make desalination in Arizona a reality. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Director. Okay, questions? One question I have, and I'd take anybody's answer, is that the Director and others have talked about cost and that they are currently coming more in line with what we are paying. Is there anybody who could give us a upside downside? I mean, Director, you had mentioned that local costs in the Phoenix metro area could be $750 to $1,100 plus per acre foot, which is, I mean, when I looked at the general costs of a membrane plant, that's very doable. Others, Chuck, any response to that, or Poseidon, or any of you? Here, do you have a mic?
Well, I think the issue of cost is so site-specific that it's very difficult to make generalities. For instance, people often quote the cost of the Carlsbad water. In its first year, is over on the order of $2,200 per acre foot. But it escalates at about 2%, 2.5% a year. So in relatively few years, it starts to get to the point where it's competitive with an escalating imported met water price. Having said that, of that $2,200, roughly $400 or maybe $450 represents a pipeline. So it's not really the desal plant. If you have access to a better interconnection, a different facility would avoid that cost. And of course, there's the cost of electricity. I don't know what industrial rates are here in Arizona, but we're paying 12 to 13 cents a kilowatt hour, and that represents 30% of the cost. So again, you need it's so specific. And of course, California is very expensive to build because of the seismic requirements, which I think are maybe not the same here. So I just think it's the costs are definitely coming down in a number of areas, especially in energy use, where new technologies and membranes and the like are predicting lowering that. But the rest is very site-specific.
I'd like to add just a little bit more information about cost, not so much from the standpoint of what costs might be, but of how desal plants are typically integrated and operated within a water system. For the Alamogordo project that I was speaking of earlier, it is just but one source of water for their system. They have surface water from the mountains outside of Ruidoso. They have groundwater wells, and they intend to use their brackish water treatment plant as a peaking plant. They can use it 3-4 months in the summertime and then dial it down, very similar to what El Paso currently does. They don't run it 24/7, 365 days a year. The projects I've seen, including ones in Colorado, they're intended to be a tool in the toolbox. In essence, making your water supply more resilient and more sustainable and drought-proof.
In response to your question, Representative Bauer, and at the behest of Director Buschatzke, who's saying that's for you, the way we think about costs for particularly brackish desal plants in engineering economies, we think of the comparison to the next available supply. So when we are looking at a brackish groundwater supply that will come in between $500 an acre foot to $750 an acre foot, we have to balance that against what is our other alternative. Is that more or less expensive? Is it more reliable or less reliable than the next alternative? For a water supply that is highly reliable, of consistent quality, essentially drought-proof, when you add that value into the calculus, $500 to $750 per acre foot falls into the competitive range. For example, when you're looking at the groundwater replenishment district, the replenishment function of CAP, we have exceeded $500 an acre foot cost for a member land or member service area to pump groundwater. So that is so the brackish space is one in which I think there's the technology has evolved and the cost framework is such that it has now become a competitive resource.
If I could just add a couple of things, and one is one of the challenges within Arizona in terms of how we would utilize this desal water gets to be what would we use it for? Growth, resiliency, drought, and that might be different in different parts of the state. And then the other thing about the infrastructure and making sure you can kind of compare apples to apples is we need to leverage in existing infrastructure as much as we can. And one of the great potentials of doing a deal with Mexico or California for exchanging water is you've got excess capacity in the Central Arizona Project Canal. And CIWC entered into an agreement last year, just about this time, a little bit later in the year, with the federal government to clarify how that excess capacity, wheeling capacity, is called a system use agreement. So a very important way for Arizona to leverage the existing infrastructure. And that's just one example on a grand scale, but there are a lot of other examples.
Thank you. And if I may, just to put the cost aspect into perspective, and I think Carlos was saying something about it depends on where you're at. I talked about Freeport. We're moving water. It's 66% of the cost of that $1 billion is just moving the water up. A significant, very significant, elevation. But raw water costs, and to kind of put this into perspective, in Colorado, we're working on some projects where the cost to purchase a water right in Colorado is upwards of $30,000 an acre foot. That's not treated water. That is raw water that you have to get access to. So at $2,200 an acre foot, even the Poseidon one, that's very economical, and it's just a function of how far you're stretched on your water supplies and those sorts of things. So it's in the future. Water is going to get more expensive. I think when you're talking about desal and you're hearing people talk about the expense of it, you have to be very careful as you're listening to folks, because sometimes they'll compare it against the raw cost of CAP, which is $40, not even $100 an acre foot for untreated water. So oftentimes people will compare apples and oranges when you're looking at the cost. So it's really important to get and I'm glad that Tom brought up the treated cost of water in the Phoenix metro area. I think that was really important to sort of draw that conclusion.
Well, if the Andes are high enough and we could use gravity, couldn't we bring that to Colorado? All right. Questions, members? Noel.
As a layperson, we're a hot mic here? Okay. Excuse me, it's been a while. Okay, there we go. Can you hear me? Okay. As a layperson, I'm interested in knowing about Mexico's 1.5 million feet of acre water allocation per year, and how is that done? I mean, do they constrict the flow of the river to only ensure that 1.5 million acre feet go into Mexico, or is that regulated in any sense? Or what happens if there's excess capacity in water and it goes into Mexico? Then we're kind of out of that. Also, can Mexico, if they don't get to use their full allotment, is there any credit that they get? So if you could kind of inform me, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
So yes, they get 1.5 million acre feet on an annual basis pursuant to the treaty. The Bureau of Reclamation, who basically runs the river from Hoover Dam down to the Mexican border, tracks the deliveries to Mexico. There are situations where Mexico gets a little bit more than 1.5 million acre feet, but as we've been in this drought for the last 18 years or so, Reclamation has been much better about making sure they ratchet down and get as close to the 1.5 million acre feet as they can. And it gets complicated because in the Yuma area, they have to pump water to drain, lower the water table, reduce the salt, et cetera, so they can farm. And there's complicated formulas on how it all works. And there's a very complicated, like octopus-looking diagram that Reclamation uses in the Yuma area to try to manage all these deliveries. But they do a very good job. In terms of Mexico's ability to take unused water and store it in the lake, in Lake Mead, except for a one-time situation in which there was an earthquake on Easter Sunday 2010, damaging Mexican agricultural infrastructure in the Mexicali Valley. The United States agreed as a matter of comity to let that unused water be stored in Lake Mead in the name of Mexico for them to recover at a later point in time. It's part of the 18 feet that Chuck talked about. It's about 3 feet at this point that's still sitting up there. Under the terms of Minute 323, Mexico can purposely conserve water, take efforts to conserve water through fallowing of land or increasing efficiencies, lining canals, and have that water stay in Lake Mead for their future use. similar to the way we can do that in the United States in the lower basin states. And again, part of that deal is also if entities like CAWCD here help pay for that conservation, that water gets pushed into the CAWCD column for their future use out of the lake. So those are some of the ways Minute 323 and the treaty interact and how we're gaining collaborative benefits in really dealing with Mexico.
Thank you. Other questions? Mr. Lawrence.
Is there at present an argument between the tribes and the state of Arizona on the use of water, and how do we understand that argument, please?
Director?
So I don't know that there's an argument between the tribes and the state of Arizona right now. I'm not exactly sure what you're referencing, but I think one of the issues that we have been struggling with within our state, and it relates to how we protect Lake Mead, and there's something called intentionally created surplus. In other words, the ability for an entity to purposely conserve water, put it in Lake Mead. It temporarily benefits the lake elevations, but you can take it out with some restrictions out into the future. There's an issue as to whether or not certain tribes have the right to do that today. And there are different factions within the state who believe different things about that. I will say the state of Arizona believes that tribes who have settled their water right claims to in-state supplies of water, Salt River, Verde River, etc., who have taken water off the Colorado River in satisfaction of those claims, have the right to do that intentionally created surplus pursuant to the terms of the 2007 agreement that created the ability to do that. And I know there are others who don't agree with that, so that might be the controversy that you've been hearing about.
Thank you, Director. Other questions, members? Noel.
I've been told that 80% of the water that comes in with the CAP is used for agriculture. And most agriculture is flood irrigation, which is very wasteful. And so what can be done to make that system more efficient and free up more water for the expected growth? And
so my former boss is telling me it's 60%. And I always agree with her when she's my former boss. But I think there's maybe some misunderstanding about how agriculture in the CAP service area uses its water. And pursuant to the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, all agriculture within the three counties, essentially they're the same as active management areas, Maricopa, Pinal, Pima, had caps on their total water use, a water duty, an allotment, but they're also required to increase their efficiency, and many of them have gone away from flood irrigation. Many of them have on-farm efficiencies of 75 to 80% or better, which is very good, actually. Even the ones that use flood irrigation, some of them might be able to get there, but many of them have gone away from flood irrigation to sprinklers or other methodologies. With flood irrigation, if you laser level your land and you manage the water deliveries properly, you can get high efficiencies. So we believe that in Arizona, we have some of the highest efficiency agriculture in the entire Colorado River Basin. You look across the river from Yuma in the Imperial Irrigation District, their efficiencies are in the range of 50 to 60%. So we've done a great job in the state of Arizona with agriculture becoming more efficient.
Mr. Cullum.
So I appreciate the former director and the current director interest in CAP agriculture. As the regulators of the Groundwater Management Act, there are very specific, stringent efficiency standards for irrigation in the Central Arizona Project Service Area. We commissioned a study by HDR in 2013 that basically audited the irrigation activities in Pinal County, and that report came back that the irrigation districts, Hohokam, Maricopa, and central Arizona were on average operating between 80 and 85% efficiency on on-farm irrigation with essentially zero tailwater losses because of the way they operate those irrigation districts. And Tom's correct, pointing to our friends in California in the Imperial Irrigation District, where they aspire to 60% efficiency. What that really means is when people characterize flood irrigation in central Arizona, I imagine just wild flood where there's a turnout and it just spreads for 24 hours all over the field. And what Tom alluded to or said directly was that today these fields that are flood irrigated are short run, laser leveled, and they have uniform flow for just the amount of water that is required for that crop cycle, for that irrigation cycle. And even beyond that, to our friend from Israel, Clive, they are growing. There are farmers in central Arizona growing alfalfa on drip. And it's an amazing technology, and it's being more and more widely implemented in central Arizona because of the economics of water. Water is more expensive. CAP ag water is the most expensive ag water in the state of Arizona. And so for those farmers to be profitable, they want to use that water as efficiently as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Mr. Slinger.
Thank you. One of the speakers mentioned that we're using less water today in Arizona than we were 60 years ago. I hope I understood that correctly. I think it may have been the gentleman here on the who was just speaking. I'm curious, is our water usage still going down? Are the efficiencies that we're bringing into agriculture still resulting in a decrease in the amount of annual water usage?
You want to take it, Tom?
So I think our data goes through at this point 2015 about. We are compiling our 2016 data to update that graphic that I just talked about, those numbers. And I still think we are in that same ballpark of using slightly less water with our, again, population and economy continuing to grow. And we'll have the numbers relatively soon. We're fleshing them out internally in DWR to fact check them, so to speak.
The modeling that the department uses is, as you can imagine, this can be very complicated in use, transition use from agriculture to homes and tile roofs. Generally, we would acknowledge that it takes less water for a subdivision than 80 acres of alfalfa. So a lot of that is in the calculus of how we model forward, how much agriculture will be there, et cetera, how much transition will take place. But the advancements in drip irrigation, subterranean drip irrigation, when we went on our little tour down to Pinal County, that's incredible. It was very impressive, and we're grateful. And much of that's driven by the cost. I mean, and so we're grateful for that. Questions? Other questions? Yes, Mr. Allen.
Thank you all for coming. We always need to talk about water every year because it's, this is what this state's about. Forest health, I think, is another big water issue. We are up against, for those of you from Boston, we're a state bigger than Massachusetts, but we live in Rhode Island. Okay, we're a lot of our state is forest, and we have forest health issues. We lose millions of acres, many acres feet of water in the fact that we don't get the water down to the ground. But we've gotten 50,000 acres a year to do forest thinning. We have the capacity to do 15,000 a year. We have a water interest. We have a fire interest. We have private property interests. In the water scheme, how much is that water worth to us, and where it is, and getting it into our aquifers, and how does that, if we could get forest health a little further along, what does that do? And I know CAP is not you, but director. So
that issue of the forest health also applies to the Colorado River Basin, which part of the reduction, I think, of flow we've seen in Colorado Basin is because of poor forest health in that watershed as well. But within Arizona, again, it will improve recharge into the aquifers. It will improve the runoff into the Saltford, Gila rivers, et cetera, if you do that forest restoration. You mentioned some good numbers that sound big about, the forest restoration underway, and I'm not meaning to downplay those, but we've got exponentially larger needs than 50,000 acres a year. And the challenge has been, I think, to find industry that can have the certainty that they can grow on that thinned forest product and be able to sell it. And that, I think, has been the biggest challenge, in my understanding, in Natural Resources Policy. Hunter Moore, who I work for in the governor's office, is heavily involved in the forest health issues, so I get bits and pieces from him. That is what we really need to find a path forward for, to successfully really thin a lot of the forests in the state.